Hello, Joe Shaw here, full stack engineer in the Incubation Engineering Department, looking at APM, application performance, monitoring management, and observability solutions. So just as a brief catch up from last time, what we're looking at is how we integrate our existing metric storage solution that uses ClickHouse and currently supports the Datadog agent with GitLab, so that when you're setting up an agent, with it being Datadog or potentially other agents, you can specify the GitLab project ID and optionally an environment ID within that project, so that we can validate against those and store those in the ClickHouse database. And that's now a requirement once I've completed the merge request. So just as a brief reminder, this is the issue that we've got for project and environment integration. Datadog sends an initial validate request with an API key. We use GitLab's version endpoint as part of the REST API to validate the key against that. And then Datadog immediately afterwards sends an initial intake request. And this intake request will have host keys in. We can see an example intake request here as part of this documentation. Has a lot of stuff in it, but one thing that we're interested in is that we can have these host tags and we can set up global values like the GitLab environment ID and GitLab project ID that are related to the API key as specified in the header with the agent that we then pass through. We can then just collapse this down. There's a bit of documentation in here about how we then use the GitLab API to make requests to get a project and validate its ID, and optionally check the name against that if we're using the name instead, and then optionally get the environment. And then we also check that the user has the relevant permissions so that they have a developer level permission against that project. And then we will accept writes against the series endpoint of Datadog, of the Datadog API. And what we do, if I have a look at the open merge request here, which is functionally complete, I'm just doing a bit more testing around this now. One of the key details is that this is where we've now introduced Redis into the solution as a session store. We use Redis quite a lot at GitLab with the Rails component, so it seems like an obvious choice here. With a time to live of 60 minutes per session, what we do in the Redis via the API is to store a hash of the API key in the host. We actually prefix the length of these keys in front of each one of those as we add them together so we don't get collisions. And we use a hash set in Redis to store the validated project and environment. That way we don't have to keep going back to GitLab constantly to revalidate those values, and it will be valid for a certain amount of time, 60 minutes in this case. We could configure that. Also, it's the case that with Datadog, those host tags aren't sent through in subsequent metric storage requests. So we need a way of storing this metadata based on the API key and host. And the assumption here is that as long as we've got a specific host ring and agent, that will be tied to a specific GitLab project. So that's a kind of limitation here, but I think we can live with that. If the user needs to change that, then they just generate a new API key for another project, or change those tags and restart the agent, and a new session will be created, for example. So that should be fairly straightforward. We've had to make some changes to the database to add the project ID and environment ID in there as well. So I'll give you a brief demo of that. Before I do that, actually, what I'm going to do is in the APM project I've already got here, I'm going to create a project access token. So this could be a user access token that we could create for individual users as long as they have developer level permissions, or it can be a project access level one. And I'm just going to give it the read API permission there. And I'll just leave it as maintainer. It doesn't need any specific more complex role than that. It could be a developer as well. So you can see you attach a role to that there. And we've got the read API. So all we need is that minimal scope. We only need to go and get the project information from GitLab specifically. So let's create that access token. I'm going to copy that. I will delete this before I'm done. So now, if I look at our Helm deployment in here, this is the one we use for development, but I'm going to use this for convenience for this demo. At the moment, there's no GitLab URL specified because in dev mode, it uses a stub that we've created, which provides some pre-canned GitLab responses to projects and environments. So we can easily test against that rather than having to have a GitLab instance set up. And that was very easy to write. The REST API is very, very simple. So what we'll do is override that with the actual GitLab URL. So we're going to use gitlab.com. That could be any instance. And then what we're going to do in the Datadog configuration, we've got a Datadog that's deployed in development here. That means that it's much easier for testing. We're going to set it to that API key that we've just set up, and the other things are set. What we're actually going to do now is go back here, and we're going to set this GitLab project ID. We're not going to bother with an environment ID, that's optional. So we've got a GitLab project ID. This is set up to a default value here at the moment for testing with that stub. And this is a sort of in the REST docs. This is a project that's in the examples that I've copied. And these environment tags will take either the full project path or just the integer ID. The integer ID is what gets stored in the database. So I'll show you that. So if we look at our APM project here, we can take the full path of that and put it in here. So we're linking this deployment to this project. And that should be enough to get that up and running. So now if we go into here, we'll see that Datadog and the gateway are going to restart. Now, if we look at the gateway logs, this should start to get some new logs in now as we start to reconfigure and set ourselves up. And we're getting access requests here while the agent comes in, and we've hit an intake URL. You can see there if I stop the logs. So that's come in, and that's validated now. So that will have taken the API key and verified that against GitLab. And we can see that now if we go into the ClickHouse cluster, and we're just going to run a ClickHouse client here, use the APM database, and I've got a pre-canned query here just to demonstrate this. So we're saying get all the metrics where the project ID is this specific project ID. So again, if we go back to APM, the project that we've got here, you see that matches the project ID there, which is the integer ID of the project in GitLab. Let's go back to the terminal, and we're just saying, let's just see what the system CPU measurements we've got, and we're going to cap that just at one record. I don't want to get all the records out of the database there. And you can see we've just got a new one in. It's got that correct project ID. We didn't specify an environment ID, so these are just set to 0, just because nullable handling ClickHouse with sorting keys is a bit awkward. So just assume 0 means empty with my host and the newest timestamp. And you can see based on my system clock that that's a fairly new timestamp. So then we get more records in. I could limit that to 5. You can see the most recent CPU records coming from that host. So that's all tied together. And if I were to change it so that the API key were wrong, then we wouldn't see any more records. You know, if I were to change that to a totally incorrect API key, that would start to fail because the Redis session uses a hash based on that key and the host name. So likewise, if a new host is added with the API key, it's got to go to GitLab and do the verification before that will become value in the Redis cache that we can reuse between requests. So back to my issue. So that's that demoed for you. So I just need to merge that after I've done a bit more testing. So I do have a lot of unit and integration tests there, but I want to do some more manual testing where I set up environments and put the wrong environment IDs in and things like that and see how it behaves. After that, I'm wanting to start investigating ClickHouse for storing logs because I think it's quite important to get those two things underway as well as metrics. My initial review is going to be looking at this C low-key implementation where the Grafana's low-key design has been built out with ClickHouse here. I'm going to see what this looks like because this could be quite useful. If it supports the native logql language from Grafana, then it might be quite a nice backend to at least start with off the shelf. So that's everything from me for now, and thank you for watching.